At exactly 7:34 a.m. on what should have been the happiest day of his life, Michael Crawford sent a text message to his bride that read, "I love you more than anything. I'm sorry." And then he vanished. No explanation. No goodbye. Just gone. What happened in the next 72 hours would expose a truth so devastating it would tear apart two families and leave an entire community questioning everything they thought they knew about the man they trusted. This is a story about secrets, the kind that hide in plain sight, the kind that fester beneath smiles and Sunday dinners until one day they explode in ways nobody could have predicted. Michael Crawford was 34 years old, a mechanical engineer at a mid-sized firm in Columbus, Ohio. He wasn't flashy. He didn't seek attention. He was the kind of man who showed up early to help set up folding chairs at community events, who remembered your kids' names, who never raised his voice. His fiancée, Sarah Mitchell, was a pediatric nurse at Riverside Hospital, 29 years old, with a laugh that could fill a room and a kindness that drew people to her like gravity. They met at a friend's backyard barbecue 3 years earlier. Michael had been grilling burgers, Sarah had brought homemade potato salad, and by the end of the night, they were sitting on the porch steps talking about everything from childhood dreams to fears about getting older. It was the kind of organic, unforced connection that everyone hopes to find. Their engagement 14 months later felt inevitable, natural, right. But on April 13th, the morning of their wedding, Michael Crawford disappeared, and what investigators uncovered in the days that followed would reveal that the man everyone thought they knew had been living with a weight so crushing, he believed the only way to protect the woman he loved was to walk away from her completely. This is that story. And I need to warn you, it doesn't end the way you think it will. Because, sometimes, the truth is more complicated than we want it to be. Sometimes, love means making a choice that breaks your own heart to save someone else's life. Let me take you back 6 months before the wedding, to a cold November evening when Michael Crawford made a decision that would set everything in motion. He was sitting in his apartment, the one he still kept even though he spent most nights at Sarah's place, scrolling through his email when he saw a message from a DNA ancestry service he'd used 4 months earlier. He'd submitted his sample on a whim, curiosity more than anything else. His mother had always been vague about his father's side of the family, deflecting questions with practiced ease, and Michael had learned early on not to push. But at 34, with a wedding on the horizon and thoughts of future children filling his mind, he wanted answers. The email subject line read, "You have new DNA matches." Michael clicked it open, expecting maybe a distant cousin or a third-degree relative he'd never heard of. What he found instead was a match labeled "close family," with a shared DNA percentage that indicated either a half-sibling or a parent. The name attached to the profile was David Brennan. Michael stared at that name for a full minute, his coffee growing cold in his hand, trying to process what he was seeing. He'd never heard that name before in his life. He clicked on the profile. The photo showed a man in his late 50s, weathered face, gray stubble, eyes that looked tired in a way that went deeper than just lack of sleep. The location listed was Marion Correctional Institution, a prison. Michael's hands started shaking. He opened a new browser tab and typed in the name. What came up made his stomach drop. David Allen Brennan, age 57, currently serving year 19 of a 35-year sentence for armed robbery, assault, and conspiracy to commit murder. The articles detailed a string of crimes spanning the late 90s and early 2000s. Brennan had been part of an organized theft ring operating across the Midwest, targeting jewelry stores, pawn shops, and small banks. The operation had been violent. 2 people had been shot during robberies, though neither died. When police finally caught up with Brennan and his associates in 2006, they found weapons, stolen goods worth over $2 million, and evidence linking them to unsolved crimes dating back a decade. Michael sat there in the dark of his apartment, the glow of his laptop, the only light, and felt his entire understanding of himself shift. His mother had told him his father was a man she'd dated briefly in her early 20s, someone who left town before she even knew she was pregnant. She said she'd tried to find him but never could. She said he wasn't worth looking for. Now Michael understood why. He didn't tell Sarah. Not right away. He told himself he needed time to process it, to figure out what it meant, if it meant anything at all. But the truth was, he was terrified. Terrified that this information would change how she saw him. Terrified that the daughter of 2 high school teachers, a woman from a stable, loving family who'd never even gotten a speeding ticket, would look at him differently knowing his biological father was a violent criminal. So he kept it to himself. He messaged David Brennan through the DNA site, a short, careful note, asking if they could talk. 3 days later, he got a response. It was brief. "I've been waiting for you to find me." What did that mean? Who was asking questions? He wrote back asking for clarification. The response took a week. When it came, it was longer, more detailed, and far more disturbing. David explained that he'd kept tabs on Michael over the years, as much as he could from inside. He knew about Sarah. He knew about the engagement. And he knew that 3 of his former associates, men who'd evaded conviction and were still operating outside prison walls, had recently been asking around about Michael. They wanted to know where he lived, where he worked, who he was connected to. David's message ended with a single line. "They think you have something I hid before I got locked up. You need to be careful." Michael's mind raced. He didn't have anything. He didn't even know this man existed until a week ago. But clearly, these people didn't believe that. Or didn't care. Over the next 2 months, Michael tried to handle it quietly. He hired a private investigator to look into the men David had named. He changed his routines, started checking over his shoulder, installed a security camera at his apartment. He didn't tell Sarah because he didn't want to scare her, didn't want to pull her into something that might be nothing. But it wasn't nothing. In early March, a month before the wedding, Michael came home to find his apartment had been broken into. Nothing obvious was taken, no TV, no laptop, but his desk drawers had been rifled through, his closet disturbed, papers scattered. Whoever had been there was looking for something specific. Michael called the police, filed a report, but he knew they wouldn't find anything. These weren't amateurs. That night, lying in bed at Sarah's house, listening to her breathe beside him, Michael made a decision. He would go through with the wedding. He would marry the woman he loved. And then, after the honeymoon, he would figure out a way to end this. He'd confront David's associates, make them understand he didn't have whatever they were looking for, find a way to make this stop. But he was running out of time, and he knew it. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's get back to what happened on the morning Michael disappeared, because this is where everything fell apart. April 13th started, like any wedding day should. Clear skies, temperature climbing into the mid-60s, that perfect spring weather that feels like a blessing. The ceremony was scheduled for 3 p.m. at a small lakeside venue just outside Columbus, a place Sarah had fallen in love with the first time they visited. Michael had spent the night before at his best friend Jason's house, tradition and all that, while Sarah stayed at her parents' place with her bridesmaids. At 6:30 a.m., Michael was awake, staring at the ceiling. Jason later told police that Michael had barely slept, tossing and turning all night, checking his phone every 20 minutes. When Jason asked if he was having second thoughts, Michael laughed it off, said he was just excited, nervous in the normal way grooms get nervous. But Jason remembered something else. He remembered that when Michael's phone buzzed around 6:15, Michael's face went pale. Then he got up, got dressed, said he needed to run out and grab coffee and breakfast pastries for everyone. He'd be back in an hour. Michael left Jason's house at 6:50 a.m. Security footage from a Speedway gas station 3 miles away shows him pulling in at 7:04. He went inside, bought a large coffee and a bottle of water, paid cash. The clerk later said he seemed distracted, kept glancing at his phone, barely made eye contact. Michael got back in his car, a blue Honda Accord, and drove north on Route 33. This is where the timeline gets fragmented. A traffic camera caught his car passing through an intersection at 7:18 a.m., heading toward the rural roads that wind through farmland and patches of woods north of the city. Another camera, this one at a small country market, shows his car parked in the lot at 7:31 a.m. Michael is visible getting out, walking around to the passenger side, opening the door, and appearing to look at something on the seat. Then he looks up sharply, staring at something off camera. He closes the door, gets back in, and drives away quickly. At 7:34 a.m., Sarah received the text message, "I love you more than anything. I'm sorry." She read it 3 times, confused, thinking maybe he was apologizing for being nervous or sentimental. She texted back with a heart emoji and, "See you at the altar." Michael never responded. By 9 a.m., Jason was starting to worry. Michael hadn't come back with breakfast. He wasn't answering calls. Jason drove the route he thought Michael would have taken, checking coffee shops and bakeries, thinking maybe his car broke down. Nothing. At 10 a.m., Jason called Sarah. She tried to stay calm, told herself there was a reasonable explanation, maybe a flat tire, maybe his phone died. But when 11 a.m. came and went with no word, the panic started to set in. Sarah's father called the police. Adults go missing for a few hours all the time, and technically Michael hadn't been gone long enough to file a report. But given the circumstances, a wedding in 5 hours, a groom who'd sent a cryptic text and vanished, they agreed to start looking. By noon, officers had located Michael's car. It was parked on a gravel pull-off near Wolfpen Ridge Road, a winding 2-lane surrounded by dense woods. The driver's side door was unlocked. Michael's phone was on the front seat, battery dead. His wallet was in the glove compartment, keys in the ignition. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no damage to the vehicle. But Michael Crawford was gone. The wedding was postponed. Guests were notified. Sarah sat in her childhood bedroom in her wedding dress, crying so hard she couldn't breathe, while her mother held her and whispered things that were supposed to be comforting but just felt hollow. Outside, search teams were already assembling. Police, volunteers, search and rescue dogs. They combed the woods around where Michael's car was found, calling his name, looking for any sign of him. Hours passed. The sun began to set. And there was nothing. No footprints leading into the trees, no torn clothing, no blood. It was as if Michael had simply stepped out of his car and ceased to exist. That first night, theories started to spread. Some people whispered that he got cold feet, that he couldn't go through with it, and ran. Others thought something terrible had happened, an accident, a medical emergency. Sarah refused to believe either. She knew Michael. She knew he wouldn't leave her like this, but she also couldn't make sense of it. Why would he drive out to the middle of nowhere? The questions piled up with no answers, and with every hour that passed, the fear grew heavier. By the second day, the story had made local news. Groom vanishes hours. Before wedding ran on every Columbus station, and the tips started pouring in. People claimed they'd seen Michael at rest stops, gas stations, walking along highways. None of them panned out. Police interviewed everyone close to him. Jason, Sarah, Michael's mother, co-workers, friends. Everyone said the same thing. Michael was a good guy, reliable, steady, not the type to just disappear. But then detectives started digging deeper, and they found things that didn't fit the picture everyone had painted. Michael's bank records showed he'd withdrawn $3,000 in cash over the past month in small increments. His credit card showed charges at a private investigation firm. His browser history, recovered from his laptop, showed searches for names, criminal records, and something that made investigators pause. How to disappear without a trace. When they showed this to Sarah, she looked like she'd been slapped. She had no idea about any of it. She didn't know about the withdrawals, the PI, the searches. Michael had hidden all of it from her. Detective Linda Vasquez was the lead investigator on the case. She was 46, 22 years with Columbus PD, and she'd worked missing persons cases that still kept her up at night. Something about this one felt off from the start. The abandoned car, the cryptic text, the secret financial moves. It had the hallmarks of a planned disappearance, but the timing made no sense. Why go through with wedding planning? Why say yes to everything? Why not just call it off weeks earlier if you wanted out? Unless he wasn't running from the wedding. Unless he was running from something else. Vasquez requested Michael's phone records. When they came back, she found something interesting. In the 2 months leading up to his disappearance, Michael had received calls from a blocked number, sometimes multiple times a day. He rarely answered, and when he did, the calls were short. She also found texts to and from the private investigator he'd hired, messages that referenced surveillance and 3 individuals of interest, but no names. Vasquez tracked down the PI, a man named Ron Kellerman who operated out of a cramped office above a dry cleaner. Kellerman was reluctant to talk at first, client confidentiality and all that. But when Vasquez explained the situation, he relented. Kellerman told her that Michael had come to him in January, asking for help tracking 3 men. He'd given Kellerman names and old mugshots, said these men might be looking for him and he needed to know where they were, what they were doing. Kellerman ran the names. All 3 had criminal records. All 3 had been associates of a man named David Brennan, currently incarcerated. Kellerman had been updating Michael regularly, letting him know the men's locations, their known activities. And then, 2 weeks before the wedding, Kellerman had informed Michael that all 3 men had been spotted in the Columbus area. They'd been asking around, showing Michael's photo, claiming they were old friends trying to reconnect. Kellerman had advised Michael to go to the police. Michael said he would. He never did. When Vasquez heard this, the case shifted. This wasn't a groom with cold feet. This was a man who believed he was in danger. She immediately started looking into David Brennan and his associates. What she found painted a grim picture. Brennan was locked up, but the 3 men Michael had been tracking, Carl Voss, Eric Hammond, and Tony Ricci, were all still active. Voss had done time for assault, Hammond for theft and fraud, Ricci for weapons charges. They were suspected in several unsolved robberies, but nothing had ever stuck. And now they were in Columbus, looking for Michael Crawford. Vasquez issued a bolo for all 3 men. She also got a warrant to search Michael's apartment more thoroughly. What the initial officers had missed, Vasquez's team found. Hidden in the back of Michael's closet, tucked inside an old shoebox, was a stack of letters. They were from David Brennan, sent over the past 3 months. Michael had been communicating with him through old-fashioned mail, keeping it off digital channels. The letters told a story. Brennan claimed that before his arrest, he'd stolen a ledger from his crew, a detailed record of every job they'd pulled, every stolen item, every person involved. He'd hidden it, planning to use it as leverage if he ever needed a bargaining chip. But he never got the chance. He was arrested, convicted, locked away. His associates knew about the ledger. They wanted it, and now they thought Michael had it. He told Michael he'd made a mistake reaching out, that he'd put him in danger, that he should destroy the DNA match and pretend they'd never connected. But it was too late. They already knew. The last letter, dated 2 weeks before the wedding, was the most chilling. They won't stop. They'll hurt anyone, close to you, to get what they think you have. I'm sorry for what I've brought into your life. If you're reading this, you need to run. And you need to make sure she's safe. Vasquez sat in the evidence room, reading those letters, and felt a pit open in her stomach. Michael hadn't run because he was scared for himself. He'd run because he was terrified they'd go after Sarah. The text message made sense now. I love you more than anything. I'm sorry. He was saying goodbye. He was drawing them away from her. But where had he gone? And was he still alive? Vasquez ordered aerial searches expanded, brought in cadaver dogs, coordinated with state police. Days turned into a week. Sarah stopped sleeping. She moved through her parents' house like a ghost, staring at her phone, waiting for a call that never came. Friends tried to comfort her, but there was nothing to say. Michael was gone, and nobody knew if he was coming back. Then, on day 9, a hiker named Marcus Webb was walking a trail in Hocking Hills State Park, about an hour southeast of Columbus, when he noticed something odd. There was a small clearing off the main path, and in that clearing, partially hidden by brush, was a blue tarp stretched between trees. Underneath it was a makeshift shelter, some camping supplies, empty water bottles, and a backpack. Marcus called the park rangers. When they arrived and searched the backpack, they found Michael Crawford's driver's license. The discovery of Michael's campsite set off a massive search of the surrounding area. If he'd been there, he might still be close. Helicopters swept overhead, search teams moved in grids, volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through the woods calling his name. Sarah was brought to the command center, holding on to hope so fragile it felt like it might shatter if she breathed too hard. And then, on the second day of the search, late in the afternoon when the light was starting to fade, a canine unit picked up a scent trail leading away from the campsite deeper into the hills. The dog, a German shepherd named Ranger, pulled his handler up a steep incline, through thick brush, to a rocky outcrop where the trees thinned out. And there, sitting with his back against a boulder, weak and dehydrated but alive, was Michael Crawford. He looked like he'd aged 10 years. His face was gaunt, covered in dirt and scratches. His clothes were torn. He could barely stand. When the paramedics reached him, he kept saying the same thing over and over. "Is Sarah okay? Did they hurt her?" They assured him she was fine. They got him onto a stretcher, carried him down the hillside, and transported him to Athens Medical Center. Sarah met him there. The moment she walked into his room and saw him lying in that hospital bed, hooked up to IVs, she broke down. She'd been so strong, so composed through all of it, and now she just collapsed into sobs. Michael reached for her hand, and the first words out of his mouth were, "I'm so sorry." Over. The next few hours, Michael told Detective Vasquez everything. He explained about the DNA test, finding out David Brennan was his father, the letters, the threats. He explained that in the weeks leading up to the wedding, the calls from blocked numbers had escalated, voicemails that were vague but menacing. "We know where she works. Pretty place for a wedding. You should answer when we call." Michael knew what they wanted. They thought he had the ledger. But he didn't. He'd never even met David Brennan in person. He didn't have access to anything Brennan had hidden. He tried to tell them that through the PI, tried to get word to them that they were chasing nothing, but they didn't believe him. And then, the morning of the wedding, Michael got a call. It wasn't blocked this time. It was from a number he recognized from the PI's reports. Carl Voss. The voice on the other end was calm, almost friendly. "Morning, Michael. Big day, huh? Listen, we need to have a conversation. You're gonna meet us, or we're gonna have that conversation with your bride instead. You've got 1 hour to decide." The call ended. Michael sat in his car outside that country market, hands shaking, mind racing. He thought about calling the police, but he was terrified they wouldn't get there in time, that Voss and the others would see cops and go after Sarah anyway. He thought about showing up at the wedding, pretending everything was fine, but he knew they'd be watching. They'd make a move. People would get hurt. So he made a choice. A desperate, terrified choice. He sent Sarah that text, turned off his phone, and drove. He didn't have a plan beyond getting as far from her as possible, leading them away, making himself the target so she'd be safe. He drove to Hocking Hills because he remembered camping there as a teenager, knew the trails were dense and easy to get lost in. He parked his car off Wolfpen Ridge Road, walked into the woods, and kept going until he couldn't see the road anymore. He figured if they were tracking him, they'd find the car and assume he was nearby. He'd stay hidden, wait them out, hope they'd give up, and leave Sarah alone. It was not a good plan. It was barely a plan at all. But Michael was operating on panic and adrenaline, and in that moment, it was all he could think to do. He'd brought some cash, a water bottle, a jacket. He hadn't brought food, a tent, or any real camping gear. He'd thought he'd only need to hide for a day or two. He had no idea it would turn into 9 days of hell. Michael described those 9 days like they were a fever dream. The first 2 nights were the worst. Cold, hungry, jumping at every sound. He moved constantly, never staying in one place long, terrified that every snapped twig was someone coming for him. He found a small stream, drank from it even though he knew he shouldn't. He foraged for berries, ate them even though he wasn't sure if they were safe. On the 3rd day, he stumbled across an abandoned campsite and found the tarp and some old supplies. He set up his shelter and tried to wait it out. But isolation does things to your mind. Michael started losing track of time. He'd think a day had passed when it had only been hours. He talked to himself, imagined conversations with Sarah, replayed that morning over and over, wondering if he'd made the right choice. By day 7, he was seriously considering walking out, turning himself in to the nearest ranger station, facing whatever consequences came. But he was weak, disoriented, and he wasn't sure he could make it back to civilization on his own. On day 9, he heard the helicopters. He heard people calling his name, and he realized that hiding wasn't protecting anyone anymore. He was just hurting the people who loved him. So when he heard the search dog barking, he didn't run. He just sat down and waited to be found. Vasquez listened to all of this, took notes, and then asked the question that had been gnawing at her. Did Voss or his crew ever come after you in the woods? Michael shook his head. I never saw them. I don't know if they even tried to follow me. Maybe they realized I didn't have what they wanted. Or maybe they just moved on. Vasquez didn't say it out loud, but she doubted that. Men like Voss didn't just move on. They'd been quiet because they were waiting, watching. 2 days after Michael was found, Detective Vasquez got a break in the case. Acting on a tip from an informant, Ohio State Highway Patrol pulled over a vehicle on Interstate 71. Inside were Carl Voss, Eric Hammond, and Tony Ricci. They were clean, no weapons, no stolen goods, nothing that would warrant an arrest. But Vasquez had enough to bring them in for questioning. All 3 lawyered up immediately. They denied knowing Michael Crawford. They denied making any threats. They said they were in town visiting family, just passing through. Without hard evidence linking them to any crime, Vasquez had to let them go. But she made sure they knew they were being watched. She told them that if anything happened to Michael or Sarah, they'd be the first people she came for. Voss smiled when she said it, a cold, empty smile that made her want to hit him. No harm intended. They walked out of the station, got back in their car, and left Columbus. Vasquez ran surveillance on them for 2 weeks. They drove back to Cleveland, went about their business, made no attempt to contact Michael. It seemed, for the moment, they'd given up. But Vasquez knew better than to trust that. She warned Michael to stay vigilant, to consider changing his name, moving, starting over somewhere new. Michael listened, nodded, but his mind was somewhere else. He was thinking about Sarah. She'd been there every day at the hospital, sitting beside his bed, holding his hand. But something had changed. She was quieter. She'd look at him, and he could see the hurt in her eyes, the betrayal. Not because he'd left, but because he'd shut her out. Because he'd made a decision that affected both their lives without including her. One evening, after the doctors cleared him to go home, Sarah drove him back to his apartment. They sat in the car for a long time, neither of them speaking. Finally, Sarah said, I need to understand something. Did you ever plan to tell me? Michael closed his eyes. I was going to. After the wedding, after the honeymoon. I thought I could handle it on my own. I didn't want to drag you into my mess. Sarah's voice cracked. Your mess? Michael, I was supposed to be your wife. We were supposed to be a team. You don't get to decide what I can or can't handle. You don't get to disappear on me because you think you're protecting me." Michael reached for her hand. She pulled away. "I know. I was wrong. I was scared, and I made a terrible choice, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Sarah wiped her eyes. "I don't know if sorry is enough. I don't know if we can come back from this." They didn't come back from it. Not in the way Michael hoped. Over the next few months, they tried. They went to therapy, talked through everything, worked on rebuilding trust. But the damage was done. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Michael had robbed her of a choice, that he'd treated her like someone who needed to be protected instead of a partner who deserved the truth. And Michael, for all his apologies, couldn't shake the guilt. Every time he looked at her, he saw the wedding that never happened, the pain he'd caused, the life they should have had. By August, they made the decision to separate. It wasn't angry or bitter. It was just sad. They sat in the same park where they'd had their first date and agreed that they loved each other, but that sometimes love isn't enough. Sarah cried. Michael cried. And then they went their separate ways. Michael moved to Indianapolis a few months later. He changed jobs, changed his phone number, tried to start fresh. He kept in touch with Detective Vasquez, who updated him periodically on Voss and his crew. They'd been arrested in Cleveland for a different robbery, awaiting trial. The threat, for now, was neutralized, but Michael knew it would always be there, lurking in the background. The shadow of a father he never knew, the consequences of choices he never made. About a year after Michael moved to Indianapolis, he received a letter, not an email, not a text, an actual physical letter in the mail. The return address was Marion Correctional Institution. It was from David Brennan. He'd spent months trying to put distance between himself and that whole chapter of his life. But curiosity got the better of him. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten in careful, measured script. David didn't ask for anything. He didn't make excuses. He just wrote about regret. He wrote about watching his son's life fall apart from behind bars and knowing it was his fault. He wrote about the choices he'd made in his 20s and 30s, choices that seemed justified at the time, necessary even, and how he'd spent 19 years watching those choices destroy everything they touched. And then, at the end of the letter, David wrote something that Michael wasn't expecting. "I never hit a ledger. There was never anything to find. I told Voss and the others that story years ago, when they first started pressuring me for information, thinking it would buy me protection inside, make me valuable. I thought if they believed I had leverage, they'd leave me alone. Instead, I painted a target on everyone connected to me, including you. I'm sorry doesn't cover it. I know that, but it's all I have." Michael read that letter 5 times. The men who'd threatened him, who'd chased him into the woods, who'd destroyed his wedding and his relationship they'd been chasing, something that never existed. A lie told by a desperate man trying to survive prison politics. Michael felt something break open inside him when he realized that. Not anger, exactly. More like exhaustion, the kind that settles into your bones when you realize just how meaningless it all was. He wrote back. He didn't know why. Maybe he needed David to understand the full scope of what that lie had cost. Maybe he just needed to say it out loud to someone who would carry the weight of it. He told David about Sarah, about the wedding, about the 9 days in the woods and the months of therapy and the separation and the move. He told him everything. David wrote back 2 weeks later. His response was short. "I have nothing to offer you except this. You're better than I ever was. You tried to protect someone you loved. I hope someday you find a way to forgive yourself for the choice you made. I never will." They exchanged a few more letters over the following months. Nothing deep, nothing that healed anything, just a tentative connection between 2 people bound by biology and tragedy. Michael never told Sarah about the correspondence. He wasn't sure she'd want to know. In the spring of the following year, Michael got a call from Detective Vasquez. Carl Voss had been convicted on multiple charges related to the Cleveland robbery. He was sentenced to 22 years. Eric Hammond took a plea deal, got 15. Tony Ricci, facing the most evidence, got 30. They'd be old men by the time they got out, if they got out at all. The threat, the one that had hung over Michael for so long, was finally, truly gone. Vasquez asked him how he felt. Michael said he didn't know. Relief, maybe, but also a strange kind of emptiness, because the danger being over didn't bring Sarah back. It didn't undo the wedding that never happened. It just meant he was safe to live a life he no longer recognized. He thanked Vasquez for everything she'd done. She told him to take care of himself. And that was that. The last time I spoke to Michael was about 6 months ago. He's still in Indianapolis. He's dating someone new, a woman named Claire who works in environmental science. He says it's good, healthy, different from what he had with Sarah. He says he's learned to be more open, to trust people with the hard stuff instead of carrying it alone. He says he's happy, or at least working toward it. I asked him if he ever thinks about what his life would have been like if he'd made different choices that morning. He laughed, a quiet, tired laugh. Every single day. But I'm trying to let it go. Trying to believe that the life I have now is the one I'm supposed to be living. And Sarah? Last I heard, she's still in Columbus, still working as a pediatric nurse. She got engaged again last year to a high school history teacher named Marcus. They're planning a small ceremony, just close family and friends. They both are. Because if there's any justice in this story, it's that two people who loved each other and lost each other still get to find some version of peace on the other side of all that pain. So that's it. That's the full story of the groom who disappeared before his wedding day. A story about secrets and fear and the terrible consequences of trying to protect people without trusting them. A story about a father's sins reaching across generations. A story about love that wasn't enough, not because it wasn't real, but because the foundation it was built on cracked under pressure neither of them saw coming. I'll leave you with this. Life is fragile. The people we love are fragile. And the choices we make, even the ones made with the best intentions, they have power. Power to save, power to destroy, power to change everything. So when you're faced with a choice like Michael's, when you're standing at that crossroads wondering whether to trust someone with the truth or shield them from it, remember this story. Remember that partnership means facing things together, that love without honesty is just a beautiful lie, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not to run, but to stay and let someone stand beside you in the storm. So what do we take from this? What's the lesson in a story like Michael's? I've thought about that a lot while putting this together. Because on one hand, Michael did what he thought was right. He sacrificed his own happiness, his own safety, to keep Sarah out of danger. That takes courage. That takes a kind of selflessness most of us like to think we'd have but hope we never have to prove. But on the other hand, he made a choice that wasn't his alone to make. He took away Sarah's agency, her right to know what was happening, to decide for herself how to face it. And in doing so, he broke something between them that couldn't be repaired. So, was he a hero? Or was he wrong? Maybe he was. Both. Maybe that's the uncomfortable truth of stories like this. People make choices in impossible situations, and those choices have consequences that ripple outward in ways we can't always predict or control. Michael thought running would save Sarah, and in a way, maybe it did. Voss and his crew never went after her. She was never harmed. But she lost something anyway. She lost the wedding, the future, the man she thought she was going to spend her life with. And Michael? He lost all of that too. Plus, he carries the weight of knowing that his biological father's crimes reached across decades to destroy something good. That's not his fault. He didn't commit those crimes. He didn't choose David Brennan as a father. But the world doesn't care about fairness. It doesn't care that you're innocent. Sometimes, You just get caught in the blast radius of other people's choices, and you have to live with the fallout. I reached out to Sarah while researching this story. She was kind enough to agree to a brief conversation. I asked her if she'd forgiven Michael. She paused for a long time before answering. I think I understand why he did what he did, and I don't hate him, but forgiveness is complicated. He hurt me in a way I didn't think he was capable of, and I had to grieve not just the wedding, but the idea of who I thought he was. So I guess my answer is, I'm working on it. Some days are easier than others. I asked her if she'd ever consider trying again, if enough time passed. She smiled, a sad kind of smile. I don't think we get a second chance at that. Too much happened. But I hope he's okay. I hope he finds peace. Michael, when I spoke to him, said something similar. I think about her every day. I wonder if there was another way. Something I could have done differently. But I can't change it. I just have to live with it. There's a grief in that, isn't there? The grief of what could have been, the life that was right there, within reach, and then suddenly wasn't. Michael and Sarah's story isn't unique in that sense. A lot of us carry those ghosts, the relationships that fell apart, the decisions we wish we could take back, the moments we'd do differently if we had the chance, but we don't get that chance. We only get to move forward, carrying the weight of what was and trying to build something new from the pieces. So here's my question for you, and I want you to really think about it. If you were in Michael's position, what would you have done? Would you have told Sarah everything from the beginning, brought her into the plan, faced it together? Or would you have done what Michael did, tried to shoulder it alone, made the choice you thought would keep her safe? There's no right answer. I'm not sure there even can be in a situation like that. But I think it's worth asking, because the truth is, most of us will never face something this extreme, but we'll all face moments where we have to choose between protecting someone and trusting them with the truth. And those choices define us. They shape our relationships, our lives, the people we become. And what about Sarah? How would you feel if you were in her position? If the person you loved made a decision like that without you, would you be able to forgive them? Would you see it as an act of love? Or as a betrayal of trust? Again, no easy answers. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think. Tell me if you think Michael was right or wrong. Tell me if you think they should have tried harder to make it work, or if separating was the only option. Tell me how this story made you feel, because stories like this, they're not just about the people involved. They're about all of us. They're mirrors that show us who we are, what we value, how we'd react when pushed to the edge, and I think that's why they matter. That's why we tell them and listen to them and think about them long after they're over. Michael Crawford disappeared on what should have been the happiest day of his life. He didn't disappear because he didn't love Sarah. He disappeared because he loved her too much to risk her getting hurt. But love, real love. And Michael, in his fear, forgot that. He tried to be the hero, and in doing so, he lost the thing he was trying to save. That's the tragedy of this story. Not that he was found, not that Sarah was safe, but that they couldn't find their way back to each other. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about these people, even though you've never met them. That's what makes us human, I think. The ability to feel for strangers, to see ourselves in their struggles. If this story moved you, hit that like button, share it with someone who you think would appreciate it, and subscribe, because I've got more stories like this coming. Stories about real people facing impossible choices and the consequences that follow. Thank you for watching. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, take care of each other. And remember, the choices you make today, they matter. They ripple outward in ways you can't always see. Make them count. The world's hard enough without us making it harder. I'll see you in the next story.